The wallet was cold in her hand, and her heart was pounding harder than it had ever pounded in her life because the man on the ground in front of her was not breathing, and the little boy standing next to him, no older than 7, was screaming a name that made every nurse instinct in her body catch fire at once. And she dropped to her knees on the cold hospital parking lot pavement without even thinking about her $9, her rent, or the eviction notice folded up in her purse because, right now, in front of her, a child's father was dying, and she was the only person close enough to save him. Before we go further, if this story is already pulling at your heart, hit that subscribe button right now. Share this with someone who needs a good cry today, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this story is going to take you somewhere you won't forget. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Her name was Grace Miller, and 3 weeks earlier, she was standing in the tiny kitchen of her one-bedroom apartment, counting 9 crumpled dollar bills on the counter like they were the last $9 on earth, because they were. Rent was due in 4 days. She needed $640, and she had 9. Her son, Caleb, was asleep in the next room, his 6-year-old body curled up under a thin blanket, his shoes from last year too small for his growing feet, the toes worn through at the seams. Grace worked as a nurse at St. Andrew's Hospital, 12-hour shifts, sometimes double shifts, sometimes shifts nobody else wanted, and still, every single month, the math never worked out. Her husband had left 2 years ago, right after Caleb turned 4, right after the bills started piling up, right after things got hard, and he had simply stopped coming home one day, leaving behind nothing but unpaid credit card statements and a boy who still asked some nights when Daddy was coming back. Grace never had an answer for that. She just held him tighter and told him she loved him enough for 2 parents, and most nights, that was true, but it never made rent, and it never bought new shoes. That night, she sat at the kitchen table long after Caleb fell asleep, staring at the $9, feeling the walls of her tiny apartment close and around her. She thought about calling her sister, but her sister had 3 kids of her own and barely enough to keep the lights on. She thought about a payday loan, but she had done that before, and it had taken her 8 months to climb out of that hole. She thought about asking her manager for an advance, but she had already asked twice this year, and she could see the look on his face the second time, the look that said, "I like you, Grace, but I can't keep doing this." So she did what she always did. She put her head down on the table, let herself cry for exactly 2 minutes because that was all the time she allowed herself, and then she wiped her eyes, stood up, and got ready for her overnight shift because the world does not stop for broke single mothers, and neither could she. Grace worked in the emergency department that night, and it was quiet for the first few hours, the kind of quiet that made the clock move even slower. She checked on patients, changed 4 bags, comforted a scared teenager who had broken his arm skateboarding, and tried not to think about the eviction notice she knew was coming if she didn't find $640 in 4 days. Around 11 at night, everything changed. A car came screeching into the emergency bay, and a man stumbled out of the driver's seat, clutching his chest, his face pale as paper, sweat pouring down his forehead, and in the passenger seat, a little boy was screaming, absolutely screaming, the kind of scream that comes from a child watching the only parent they have left collapse in front of them. Grace was the first one out the door. She caught the man just as his knees buckled, lowered him to the ground the way she had been trained to do 1,000 times, and immediately began checking his pulse, his breathing, calling out vitals to the team rushing out behind her. His pulse was weak and irregular. His lips were turning blue. This was a heart attack, and it was happening right now, right in front of a screaming little boy who kept saying the same word over and over. "Daddy, Daddy, please, Daddy, wake up." Grace looked up for just 1 second, just long enough to see the boy's face, and something in her chest cracked wide open because he looked exactly like Caleb did the day his own father walked out the door, that same wide-eyed terror of realizing the person who was supposed to protect you forever might not be there tomorrow. She looked back down at the man, and without hesitating, she began chest compressions right there on the pavement, counting out loud, refusing to let this stranger become a statistic, refusing to let that little boy grow up without a father the way her own son might someday have to grow up without one of his parents too. The next 4 minutes felt like 4 hours. Grace pushed on his chest with everything she had, sweat dripping down her own face now, her arms burning, her voice hoarse from shouting orders to the team around her, until finally, the man gasped, a huge, ragged, beautiful gasp of air, and his eyes fluttered open. The team rushed him inside on a gurney, and Grace, breathless and shaking, turned to see the little boy standing frozen on the pavement, tears streaming down his face, completely alone. She didn't think. She just walked over, knelt down in front of him, and said the words she would have wanted someone to say to her son if their roles had been reversed. Your daddy is going to be okay. I've got him. You are not alone right now. I promise you, you're not alone. The boy collapsed into her arms and sobbed, and Grace held him on that cold pavement for what felt like forever, whispering that everything would be all right, rocking him gently the way she rocked Caleb after nightmares. And she had absolutely no idea, in that moment, that the man she had just brought back from the edge of death was Nathaniel Cole, one of the wealthiest men in the entire country, owner of Cole Industries, a name that appeared on business magazine covers and in headlines about billion-dollar deals. She didn't know it, and honestly, in that moment, it would not have mattered to her even if she had known. To Grace, he was not a billionaire. He was just a father, and his son needed someone to hold him together until help arrived. The hospital admitted Nathaniel Cole immediately, and doctors confirmed what Grace already suspected. He had suffered a serious cardiac event, and if she had not started compressions when she did, he likely would not have survived the ambulance ride, let alone made it to a hospital bed. His son, whose name Grace learned was Theo, refused to leave the waiting room, refused to eat, refused to speak to anyone except Grace, who checked on him every chance she got throughout the rest of her shift, bringing him apple juice and crackers from the nurse's station, sitting with him for 5 minutes here and there whenever she could steal the time, telling him stories about her own son to distract him from the fear eating away at his little heart. By the time her shift ended at 7 in the morning, Grace was exhausted in a way she had never been exhausted before, the kind of tired that lives in your bones. She said goodbye to Theo, promising him his daddy was strong and would wake up soon, and she drove home in her old car that made a strange rattling noise every time she braked, thinking about nothing except how badly she needed sleep before she had to pick Caleb up from her neighbor's apartment and figure out, once again, how she was going to pay her rent. She never expected to hear from either of them again. Patients came and went. That was the nature of the job. You save a life, and then you moved on to the next emergency, the next 12-hour shift, the next impossible month. She had no idea that 3 floors above where she had been standing that night, a man was waking up in a hospital bed asking his assistant one single question before he asked about anything else in the world, before he asked about his company, before he asked about his stock prices or his board meetings. He asked, "Who was the nurse that saved my life? And I need to know her name today." Grace found out 2 days later that someone had been asking about her, though she had no idea who. And honestly, she didn't have the energy to think about it much, because that same day, the eviction notice arrived, taped right to her apartment door, bright yellow and impossible to ignore, giving her exactly 72 hours to pay $640 or vacate the premises. She stood in the hallway holding that piece of paper with her hand shaking, Caleb tugging on her scrubs, asking if they could get ice cream. And she had to force a smile on her face and tell him maybe tomorrow, sweetheart. When inside, she felt like the entire world was collapsing on top of her. That night, after Caleb fell asleep, Grace sat on the floor of her apartment with her back against the wall, staring at that yellow notice. And for the first time in a very long time, she let herself really cry, not the 2-minute cry she allowed herself at the kitchen table, but the kind of cry that comes from years of carrying too much weight alone, from being strong for everyone else and never once being allowed to fall apart. From loving her son so much it hurt, and still somehow not being enough to keep a roof over his head. She cried until she had nothing left, and then she fell asleep right there on the floor, too exhausted to even make it to her bed. The knock on her door came at 9 the next morning, and Grace nearly didn't answer it, assuming it was her landlord, assuming it was more bad news, but Caleb ran to the door before she could stop him. And when she pulled herself up off the couch and walked over, she found a man in an expensive dark suit standing in her hallway, holding a black leather folder, looking completely out of place among the peeling paint and flickering hallway lights of her apartment building. He introduced himself as Nathaniel Cole's personal assistant, and Grace's stomach dropped, thinking for one terrifying second that something had gone wrong, that Nathaniel Cole had died after all, and somehow this was her fault, some legal issue, some blame being placed on her. But the assistant smiled gently and told her that Mr. Cole was recovering well, that he was asking for her, and that he had sent something for her as a thank you. Grace assumed it would be flowers, maybe a card, maybe a small gift basket, the kind of polite gesture wealthy people send when they want to say thank you without actually having to meet the person who saved their life. But when the assistant opened the black folder and handed her a single piece of paper, Grace's knees nearly gave out beneath her, because it was a check made out to her for $50,000. She stared at it so long that Caleb tugged on her sleeve, asking what was wrong, and Grace realized she was crying again, except this time it wasn't sadness pouring out of her. It was something she hadn't felt in years, something that felt dangerously close to hope. She tried to give the check back, told the assistant this was too much, that she had only done her job, that any nurse would have done the same thing. But the assistant shook his head and said Mr. Cole had been very clear. He said no amount of money could repay what she did, but this was a start, and he was asking if she was willing to come to his home so he could thank her in person, along with his son, who apparently had not stopped talking about her since the night of the accident. Grace stood frozen in her doorway for a long moment, holding a check that could change her entire life, looking down at Caleb, who was staring up at her with those same wide, hopeful eyes he had when he asked if maybe, just maybe, things were about to get a little easier. And she said yes. 3 days later, Grace and Caleb pulled up to a house that looked like something out of a movie, gates that opened on their own, a driveway longer than her entire apartment building, and a home so large that Caleb pressed his face against the car window and whispered, "Mommy, is this a hotel?" Grace was terrified walking up to that front door, terrified of not belonging, terrified of being out of place. But the moment the door opened and she saw Theo standing there, that same little boy from the hospital parking lot, his face lighting up brighter than she had ever seen it, running straight into her arms and hugging her like she was the most important person in the entire world, all of her fear melted away. And that was when she saw him, Nathaniel Cole, standing behind his son, leaning slightly on a cane, still recovering, still pale for what he had survived, but alive, and looking at her with an expression Grace had never had anyone look at her with before, an expression that held gratitude so deep it seemed to come from somewhere beyond words. He didn't say thank you right away. He just looked at her for a long moment, like he was trying to memorize the face of the woman who had given him back his life, back his son's father, back every single day he now got to wake up and see Theo's face. And when he finally spoke, his voice cracked, and he simply said, "You saved everything I have. You saved my son's whole world. I don't know how to repay that, but I'm going to try for the rest of my life." Grace, standing in the doorway of a mansion with her 6-year-old son's hand in hers, $9 and an eviction notice feeling like a lifetime away, had absolutely no idea that this single moment, this one act of stepping in and refusing to let a stranger die on cold pavement, was about to change the entire course of her life, and Theo's life, and Nathaniel's life forever. But she also had no idea about the storm quietly building behind Nathaniel Cole's closed office doors, where his late wife's sister had been circling for months, watching his health decline, waiting for her moment to take control of both his company and his son. And the moment she found out a nurse named Grace Miller had walked into their lives, everything about her carefully laid plan was about to change too. Because some people don't celebrate a miracle. Some people see a miracle and immediately start planning how to destroy it. If you're still with me right now, hearing your heart pound the way mine is, do me a favor and drop a comment letting me know you're here, because what happens next in Grace and Nathaniel's story is going to shock you. And I promise you, this is only the very beginning. Grace visited the Cole house 3 more times over the following 2 weeks, each time telling herself it was simply to check on Theo, to see how he was adjusting after nearly losing his father. But each time, she found herself lingering a little longer in Nathaniel's study, talking about nothing and everything, about grief, about raising children alone, about the terrifying responsibility of being the only parent standing between a child and the whole wide world. Nathaniel, it turned out, understood loneliness in a way Grace never expected from a man with so much money. His wife, Theo's mother, had passed away 3 years earlier from an illness that took her slowly, painfully, and Nathaniel had spent every day since trying to fill a hole in his son's heart that no amount of toys or private tutors or vacations could ever fill. "There's only one thing a boy like Theo wants," Nathaniel told her one evening, sitting across from her in his study while Theo and Caleb played somewhere down the hall, their laughter echoing through the enormous house in a way that made it feel, for the first time in a long time, like a real home instead of a museum. "He doesn't want another toy. He wants someone to tuck him in and mean it. He wants someone to notice when he's sad without him having to say it out loud." Grace felt her chest tighten, because that was exactly the kind of parent she had spent every single exhausting day trying to be for Caleb, and she said quietly, "That's the only thing that matters, Nathaniel. Everything else is just noise." It was the first time she had called him by his first name instead of Mr. Cole, and something passed between them in that moment, something neither of them said out loud, but something they both felt settle quietly into the room, like a held breath finally released. Over the following month, Grace found herself at the Cole house more and more, not because Nathaniel kept sending his assistant to invite her, though he did, but because Caleb and Theo had become inseparable, and because, if she was honest with herself, she looked forward to those evenings more than she wanted to admit. Nathaniel was nothing like she expected a billionaire to be. He didn't talk about his company unless she asked. He didn't flaunt his money. Instead, he asked her about her shifts, remembered small details about her life, asked how her feet felt after a 12-hour shift, and once, when she mentioned offhand that her car had started making a strange noise, he had it quietly fixed without telling her. And when she found out and tried to argue, he simply said, "You carry so much weight for everyone else, Grace. Just let someone carry a little bit of it for you, just this once." Nobody had ever said those words to her before. Not her ex-husband, not her own family. Nobody. And Grace, who had spent years being the strong one, the one who never asked for help, found herself, for the first time, allowing someone else to catch her when she fell instead of always catching everyone else. But not everyone was happy watching this quiet, careful love story unfold. Nathaniel's sister-in-law, a sharp, cold woman named Vivian, who had spent the last 3 years positioning herself as Theo's godmother and Nathaniel's closest advisor since her sister's death, watched Grace's growing presence in the house with a fury she hid behind polite smiles. Vivian had plans that involved eventually gaining legal guardianship influence over Theo and a permanent seat controlling major decisions at Cole Industries under the guise of protecting her late sister's legacy, and a broke single mother nurse showing up and stealing both Nathaniel's heart and Theo's affection was not part of that plan at all. Vivian began quietly making calls, quietly digging into Grace's background, quietly looking for anything she could use, and she found something. Grace's ex-husband, the man who had abandoned her and Caleb 2 years earlier, had recently resurfaced, drowning in gambling debts, and Vivian, cold and calculating, saw her opportunity. She found him within days. The offer Vivian made him was simple. $20,000, enough to clear his worst debts and buy himself some breathing room. In exchange for one thing, he would show up, claim he wanted to be a father again, claim he wanted custody of Caleb, and create just enough chaos and public embarrassment around Grace that Nathaniel would start to see her as a liability instead of the woman who saved his life. Grace's ex-husband, weak and desperate, agreed without hesitation. He showed up at Grace's apartment on a Tuesday evening, just as she was helping Caleb with his shoes before heading over to the Cole house for dinner. And the moment Grace opened the door and saw him standing there, all the color drained from her face. 2 years. 2 years of silence. 2 years of Caleb asking where Daddy was. 2 years of Grace rebuilding a life from nothing. And now here he stood, clean-shaven, wearing a new jacket she knew he could not have afforded on his own, smiling like he had never left at all. "Daddy?" Caleb's small voice cracked with a hope so raw it broke Grace's heart all over again. Because despite everything, despite the abandonment, despite the pain, her son still loved his father, still wanted him, the way children always do no matter what. Grace's ex-husband knelt down and hugged Caleb, playing the part perfectly, and then he looked up at Grace with a smile that made her stomach turn, and he said the words that would set off everything that came next. "I want my son back, Grace. I've changed. And if you try to stop me, I'll take you to court, and everyone will know exactly what kind of unfit mother leaves her child with a stranger's family every single night while she chases a rich man's money." Grace's whole body went cold. "It's not like that," she whispered, but he just smiled wider because he had already delivered the line Vivian paid him to deliver, and he knew exactly where it would land. Word reached Nathaniel by the next morning, not from Grace, who was too shaken and humiliated to even speak about it, but from Vivian herself, who arrived at Nathaniel's study with a look of practiced concern on her face, telling him gently that she hated to be the one to say this, but perhaps it was worth considering whether Grace's personal chaos, an absent husband suddenly resurfacing custody threats, public accusations, was really the kind of instability Theo needed in his life right now, especially after everything the poor boy had already been through. For one single, terrible night, it worked. Nathaniel, still weak from his heart attack, still emotionally raw, still terrified above everything else of anything that might hurt his son again, found himself doubting, found himself staring at his phone instead of calling Grace. And when Grace finally worked up the courage to call him herself, desperate to explain, desperate to tell him the truth before Vivian's version of the story hardened into something permanent, Nathaniel let the call go to voicemail. Grace sat on her bedroom floor that night, phone in her lap, tears streaming silently down her face so Caleb wouldn't hear her from the next room, and she thought, for the first time since that night in the hospital parking lot, that maybe she had let herself hope for something that was never real to begin with. Maybe men like Nathaniel Cole did not fall for women like her. Maybe this had all just been gratitude wearing the costume of something deeper. And with that thought sitting heavy and cold her chest, Grace made a decision that would change everything all over again. She decided to stop calling. She decided to protect what was left of her heart and her son's heart, and simply disappear from the Cole family's life before it could hurt any worse than it already did. But what Grace did not know, sitting alone on her floor that night, was that 3 miles away, Nathaniel Cole was standing in his son's doorway, watching Theo cry into his pillow, refusing to eat dinner, asking over and over again where Miss Grace had gone and why she stopped coming, and Nathaniel, staring at his heartbroken son, was finally starting to ask himself a question he should have asked the moment Vivian walked into his study with her practiced concern. He was starting to ask himself who actually benefited from him pushing Grace away, and the answer to that question was about to blow his entire family apart. If your heart is racing right now, you are exactly where I want you to be. So smash that like button. Tell me in the comments if you saw this twist coming. And let's go back because Grace is about to discover something about her ex-husband's sudden return that changes absolutely everything. 3 days after Nathaniel stopped answering her calls, Grace received a phone call of her own from a woman she had never met, a woman who identified herself as her ex-husband's former co-worker at a bar he used to frequent before he disappeared from Caleb's life. The woman, sounding nervous, almost guilty, told Grace something she had overheard 2 weeks earlier, something she said had been eating away at her conscience ever since. She had heard Grace's ex-husband bragging to a friend about a woman named Vivian who had paid him $20,000 to, in his words, stir up some trouble for his ex-wife. Grace nearly dropped the phone. She sat frozen at her kitchen table for a long time after that call ended, piecing together everything that had happened over the past week. The sudden reappearance of a man who had abandoned his son without a second thought, the perfectly timed custody threat, the way Nathaniel had gone cold and distant almost immediately afterward. It all made sense now, in the most painful way possible, and Grace felt something shift inside her, not sadness this time, but a quiet, steady fire. She was not going to disappear. She was not going to let a woman like Vivian rewrite her story and steal away the one real, honest connection she had found in years, not without a fight. Grace drove to the Cole estate that same evening, her hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire way, rehearsing what she would say, knowing she might not even get past the front gate. But when she arrived, it was not Nathaniel who answered the door. It was Theo, his small face lighting up the second he saw her. And before Grace could say a single word, he threw his arms around her waist and said, "I knew you would come back. I told Daddy you wouldn't just leave us. Please don't leave us." Grace knelt down, holding him tightly, and over his shoulder she saw Nathaniel standing in the hallway, watching, his face unreadable, exhausted, torn between the doubt Vivian had planted and the truth his own heart had been screaming at him for days. Grace stood up slowly, looked him directly in the eyes, and said the words she had driven 20 minutes rehearsing. "I don't know what Vivian told you, and I don't know what you believe about me right now, but I am not the villain in this story, Nathaniel. I never asked you for money. I never asked you for anything except a chance for our sons to have something good in their lives. My ex-husband did not come back because he loves Caleb. He came back because someone paid him $20,000 to destroy my name, and if you cannot see who benefits from tearing us apart, then maybe you never really knew me at all." The silence that followed felt like it lasted a lifetime. And then Nathaniel did something Grace never expected. He turned, not toward her, but toward the staircase behind him, where Vivian was standing frozen, having clearly been listening from the shadows the entire time, her face draining of all its careful composure the moment Grace's words landed in the open air between them. Nathaniel's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, but it carried the weight of a man who had just had the last piece of a puzzle click violently into place. "Vivian," he said slowly, "how did you know the exact amount of money that man was paid?" When Grace never mentioned a number, Vivian opened her mouth, searching for an explanation, but nothing came out, and in that silence, everyone in that hallway understood the truth at exactly the same moment. What happened over the next 10 minutes would change the entire Cole family forever, but I am not going to tell you what Vivian said when she finally broke, or what Nathaniel discovered in her office 3 days later that proved she had been quietly moving money out of Theo's trust fund for over a year, hiding behind the excuse of investment management. Vivian did not confess quietly. She never got the chance to, because 2 weeks later, a forensic accountant Nathaniel hired without telling anyone, not even Grace, uncovered a pattern of transfer stretching back nearly 18 months, small amounts at first, carefully hidden inside legitimate-sounding investment accounts set up in Theo's name, money that was supposed to be growing quietly until Theo turned 25. Money Vivian had been slowly siphoning into offshore accounts under her own control while presenting herself to the world as a grieving, devoted aunt protecting her late sister's only child. When Nathaniel confronted her with the evidence spread across his desk, Vivian did not cry, did not apologize, did not even attempt to explain herself the way Grace had expected. She simply straightened her shoulders and said, with a coldness that chilled the entire room, that she had spent 3 years raising money for causes, attending galas, managing his household while he buried himself in grief, and she deserved every single cent of what she had taken, because someone in this family needed to think about the future, since clearly he never would. Nathaniel had her escorted out of the house that same afternoon, and within a month, with the evidence in hand, she was formally removed from any legal involvement in Theo's trust and quietly, permanently cut off from the family entirely. But money and betrayal, as painful as they were never the deepest wound in that house. The deepest wound was the damage that had already been done between Nathaniel and Grace. The way doubt, even briefly planted, has a way of leaving roots behind long after the weed itself has been pulled. Grace found herself pulling back in the weeks that followed, polite but guarded, showing up for Theo's sake, but keeping careful distance from Nathaniel himself, because some small, wounded part of her kept whispering that if he could doubt her once, based on nothing but a stranger's manipulation, what would stop him from doubting her again someday, when it mattered even more? Nathaniel noticed the distance immediately, and it nearly destroyed him, because for the first time since his wife had passed away, he had allowed himself to feel something real again, something he had been terrified to name out loud. And now he was watching it slip through his fingers because of his own hesitation in the one moment Grace needed him to believe in her without question. He showed up at her apartment on a rainy evening. No, we said no rain. Let's say a quiet, cool evening with the porch light flickering above her door. And when Grace opened it, surprised to see him standing there alone, without his driver, without his assistant, just a man in a simple jacket standing on a cracked concrete step, he said the words he had been rehearsing the entire drive over. "I made a mistake. I let fear and grief make me doubt the one person who has never once given me a reason to doubt her. You saved my life on that pavement, Grace, and I spent this last month letting someone else's lies almost cost me the best thing that has happened to this family in 3 years. I am not asking you to forgive me tonight. I am just asking you to let me spend every single day from now on proving that I see you, all of you, the nurse, the mother, the woman who held my son together when I couldn't, and that I will never again let fear make me doubt what my heart already knew the moment I woke up in that hospital bed and asked for your name before I asked for anything else in the entire world. Grace stood in her doorway for a long moment, feeling every wall she had built over 2 years of raising a son alone, of being abandoned, of being strong for everyone but herself begin to crack, not because Nathaniel was wealthy, not because of anything he could give her, but because for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone was standing in front of her, choosing her on purpose in the light without hiding. And that is where I have to leave you tonight, because what Grace says next, and the decision she makes about her future, about Caleb's future, and about a love that started with $9 and a dying man on cold pavement, is coming right up, and I promise you, it is worth every single second of the wait. Grace did not answer him with words at first. She stepped forward off the cracked concrete step and wrapped her arms around in the way she had wrapped them around Theo that very first night in the hospital parking lot. Except this time it was not a stranger she was holding together. It was a man who had become, somewhere in the middle of $9 and a dying heartbeat in a house full of secrets, the person she trusted most in the world. Nathaniel held her back like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. And neither of them said anything for a long time, because some moments do not need words. They just need two people finally standing still long enough to let something real settle between them. When she finally pulled back, she looked up at him and said quietly, "I forgive you. Not because you're rich, not because of anything you can give me or Caleb, but because you drove here yourself on a quiet night, and you told me the truth with your own voice instead of hiding behind an assistant or a check. That's all I ever wanted from anyone. Just the truth and someone who stays." Nathaniel smiled for the first time in weeks, a real smile, one that reached all the way to his tired eyes, and he said, "Then I promise you this. You will never have to wonder again." The weeks that followed were the softest weeks Grace had known in years. Nathaniel did not rush anything. He showed up the way he said he would every single day, sometimes just for 20 minutes after her shift ended, sitting with her at her small kitchen table, drinking coffee out of a chipped mug, sometimes for entire Sunday afternoons with both boys running through the backyard of the coal estate, laughing until they collapsed in the grass. Caleb and Theo had become something closer than friends now, something closer to brothers, and watching the two boys build blanket forts together in the living room, arguing over whose turn it was to pick the movie, filled a space in Grace's heart she had not even realized was still empty. Her ex-husband disappeared again almost as quickly as he had reappeared. The moment the $20,000 for Vivian ran out, and there was no more money left to chase. And this time, when he vanished, Grace felt something different than she had the first time. The first time, his leaving had shattered her. This time, watching him choose money over his own son one more time, she felt something closer to relief, because she finally understood with total clarity that the space he left behind was never going to be filled by him. It was going to be filled by someone who chose to stay on purpose. Someone like the man now sitting across from her at her kitchen table every single day. But money, Grace was slowly learning, drew a very particular kind of attention, and not all of it was kind. It started quietly at first, a photograph of Grace and Nathaniel leaving a small neighborhood diner together, taken by someone with a phone from across the street, posted online with a caption calling her a gold-digging nurse who found her golden ticket in a hospital parking lot. Grace tried to ignore it, but the comments multiplied fast. Strangers who knew absolutely nothing about her, about the 12-hour shifts, about the eviction notice, about 2 years of raising a son completely alone, deciding they understood her entire life story based on one blurry photograph and a headline designed to make people angry. Then came the reporters. A business journalist covering coal industries picked up the story, framing it not as a love story, but as a scandal, questioning whether Nathaniel Cole, still recovering from a major health event, was in a vulnerable state of mind, questioning whether the sudden appearance of a woman from, in the article's exact words, a significantly different financial background, should raise concerns for shareholders about his judgment and his ability to continue leading the company. The article did not mention that Grace had saved his life. It barely mentioned Grace as a person at all. It mentioned her only as a variable, a risk, a headline. Nathaniel wanted to fight back immediately, wanted to issue statements, wanted to shut down every single outlet running the story. But Grace, sitting across from him one evening with the article pulled up on her phone, her hands trembling slightly as she read it for the third time, told him no. If we fight this the way you want to fight it, with lawyers and statements, we just prove their point, she said quietly. We become a story about money and reputation, instead of what this actually is. Let me handle this my way. 2 days later, Grace did something Nathaniel never expected. She agreed to a single interview, not with the business journalist who had written the scandal piece, but with a small local news station that had once covered a community fundraiser her hospital ran for uninsured families. She sat down in her nurse's scrubs, no makeup team, no styled hair, no prepared talking points from Cole Industries communications department, and she simply told the truth. She talked about the night in the parking lot, about chest compressions and a screaming little boy, and instinct taking over before fear could. She talked about $9 and an eviction notice and what it feels like to lie awake doing math that never adds up no matter how many times you run the numbers. She talked about her son's worn-out shoes, and she talked about a billionaire who fixed her car without telling her and then got embarrassed when she found out. Because for him it was never about the money. It was about someone finally letting him carry a little bit of weight that was not his to carry. I did not save Nathaniel Cole's life because he was rich, Grace said, looking directly into the camera, her voice steady even though her heart was pounding. I saved his life because he was a father dying in front of his son, and I know exactly what it does to a child to grow up wondering if their parent is ever coming back. I would have done exactly the same thing for anyone in that parking lot that night. The money never changed what happened between us. What changed things was two broken families finding a way to become one whole one. If that makes people angry, then I think the anger says a lot more about them than it does about me. The interview did not go viral in the ugly way the first article had. It went viral in a different way entirely, shared by nurses, by single mothers, by exhausted parents working double shifts all over the country who saw themselves in Grace's tired eyes and steady voice. By the end of the week, the narrative had completely flipped. Cole Industries stock, which had dipped slightly during the scandal coverage, recovered fully within days, and Nathaniel's board members, who had been quietly nervous, sent flowers to Grace's hospital with a card thanking her for reminding the public exactly why people trusted the Cole name in the first place. Life began to settle after that, or as close to settled as life ever gets. Grace cut back her hours at the hospital, not because Nathaniel asked her to, but because for the first time in years, she did not have to choose between paying rent and being present for her son's bedtime, and she wanted, more than anything, to actually be there for the small, quiet moments she had been forced to sacrifice for so long. Nathaniel healed slowly but steadily, his cardiologist calling his recovery remarkable, and everyone close to him privately agreed that the real medicine had never come from a pill bottle at all. It had come from watching his son laugh again, and from finally allowing himself to love someone without waiting for permission from his grief. 6 months after the night in the hospital parking lot, on a quiet evening with the sky painted orange over the backyard where Caleb and Theo had first built their blanket fort together, Nathaniel got down on one knee in front of Grace. No cameras, no reporters, no assistants standing nearby with folders, just the four of them because Theo and Caleb were standing right beside him, both of them grinning, so wide it looked like their faces might crack in half. "Grace," Nathaniel said, his voice thick with emotion he no longer tried to hide, "you walked into my life with $9 in your pocket and saved everything that mattered to me before I even knew your name. I didn't want to spend one more day of my life without you and Caleb as part of this family for real. Not almost, not someday, but now. Will you marry me?" Before Grace could even answer, Theo blurted out, "And can Caleb be my actual brother now? Please?" And the whole backyard erupted into laughter through happy tears. And Grace, kneeling down to hug both boys before she even answered Nathaniel, said yes to all of it, to Nathaniel, to the boys becoming brothers, to a life she never once believed she was allowed to have. Now here is where I have to be honest with you, because a story this big does not end with just a proposal in a backyard. 3 weeks before the wedding, something happened that none of them saw coming. Something that had absolutely nothing to do with Vivian or money or scandal, and everything to do with an old envelope Grace found hidden in the back of her late mother's belongings. An envelope that would reveal a secret about her own family that had been buried for over 20 years. A secret that connects to the Cole family in a way that will leave you speechless. Grace found the envelope while going through a storage unit she had been paying for since her mother passed away 4 years earlier. A small unit filled with boxes she had never had the emotional strength or the money to properly sort through. With the wedding approaching, and with Nathaniel gently encouraging her to finally close out the storage unit, instead of continuing to pay a monthly bill for boxes she never opened, Grace spent an afternoon going through her mother's old belongings, old photographs, a chipped porcelain jewelry box, and near the bottom of the last box, a yellowed envelope with her mother's handwriting on the front that simply read, "For Grace, when she is ready." Inside was a letter, and inside the letter was a truth Grace's mother had carried silently for over 2 decades. Grace's biological father was not the man she had grown up believing was her father, the quiet, kind man who died when Grace was only 9 years old. Her biological father, according to the letter, was a man her mother had a brief relationship with before Grace was born, a young engineer at the time, working on an early construction project for a growing company. A company whose name Grace nearly dropped the letter reading, because the company was Cole Industries, and a young engineer's name, the man her mother described in careful, apologetic handwriting, was Nathaniel Cole's own father, a man named William Cole, who had passed away many years before Grace ever set foot in that hospital parking lot. Grace sat on the floor of that storage unit for a long time, the letter shaking in her hands, trying to understand what this meant, trying to piece together a truth that felt almost too impossible to believe. If the letter was true, that would mean Nathaniel was not simply the man she was about to marry. He would also be, in some complicated, tangled way, family already connected to her by blood through a relationship neither of them had any idea existed, decades before either of them had been born into the lives that eventually collided in that hospital parking lot. She did not tell Nathaniel right away. She needed to know for certain first, because a secret this heavy could not be handed to him as a rumor. It needed to be handed to him as truth, or not handed to him at all. Grace quietly arranged a private DNA test, using a discreet family history service, submitting samples under careful confidentiality. And for 11 days, she carried the weight of that unopened envelope alone, smiling through wedding dress fittings, smiling through Theo and Caleb picking out matching bow ties, smiling through Nathaniel's excited plans for their future, all while a question sat heavy and unanswered in the back of her mind. Am I about to marry a man who is somehow already my family? When the results finally came back, Grace opened the email alone in her car outside the hospital, her hands trembling so badly she had to set the phone down twice before she could read the results properly. And when she finally read them, she let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 11 days straight, because the results confirmed there was no biological relation whatsoever between Grace and Nathaniel. Her mother's letter, it turned out, contained a truth that was heartbreakingly close, but not the truth Grace feared. Grace's biological father was not William Cole after all. Grace's mother, in her guilt and confusion decades earlier, had confused 2 men from that same construction project. And further digging, with the help of a kind, patient historian Grace hired to trace her mother's old employment records, revealed her actual biological father was a different engineer entirely. A man who had worked briefly for Cole Industries as a subcontractor before moving on to another company entirely. A man who had passed away years ago as well, completely unconnected to Nathaniel's family in any way at all. Grace sat in that hospital parking lot, the very same parking lot where everything had begun, and cried tears of pure relief because the man she loved really was simply the man she loved, with no complicated tangled history standing between them. Only the story they had built together with their own 2 hands, out of nothing but $9 and a dying heartbeat, and two little boys who refused to let go of each other. She told Nathaniel everything that night: the letter, the fear, the DNA test, the 11 days of silence. And Nathaniel, instead of being upset she had kept it from him, simply pulled her into his arms and said, "You carried that entire weight alone because you loved me enough to make sure you were protecting both of us before you said a single word. That is exactly the kind of person I am about to marry, Grace. Someone who protects the people she loves, even when it costs her everything to carry that weight by herself." The wedding took place on a soft afternoon in the backyard of the Cole estate. The same backyard where two boys had built their first blanket fort together. The same backyard where Nathaniel had gotten down on one knee. There were no reporters this time, no cameras from outside the family. Just the people who mattered: Grace's sister and her 3 children, a handful of nurses from St. Andrew's Hospital who had become close friends over the years, Nathaniel's oldest and most trusted colleagues, and 2 little boys standing at the front, both of them wearing matching bow ties, both of them absolutely beaming, because in exactly a few minutes, they were not just going to be best friends anymore, they were going to be brothers, officially forever. Grace walked down a simple aisle of white chairs set up in the grass, wearing a dress that was elegant but simple, nothing like the extravagant designer gowns Vivian once suggested she should feel embarrassed for not being able to afford, because Grace had chosen this dress herself, with her own money this time, money she had earned back at the hospital doing the work she loved, because some things she had learned mattered more when you built them yourself. When she reached the front, Nathaniel took her hands, and instead of reciting a long formal vow written by anyone else, he simply looked at her and said, "3 years ago, I lost my wife and thought I would spend the rest of my life just going through the motions for Theo's sake. Then a broken-down car and a bad heartbeat brought a stranger with $9 in her pocket into my life. And she did not just save me on that pavement, Grace. She has been saving me every single day since, and I intend to spend every day I have left saving her right back for the rest of our lives." Grace, through tears she did not bother wiping away, said her own vow just as simply: "I spent 2 years believing love was something that only happened to other people, something that always left, something that always cost more than it gave back. You taught me that was never true. You taught my son what it feels like to have a father who stays, and you gave me back something I thought I had lost forever the day my husband walked out that door. You gave me back hope. I promise you, for the rest of my life, I will never stop choosing you, the way you never stopped choosing me, even when it would have been easier to walk away." When the officiant finally said the words making it official, Theo and Caleb, standing at the front in their matching bow ties, threw their arms around each other before anyone even told them to, both of them laughing and crying at the same time, and the entire backyard erupted into applause because everyone there understood, in that single moment, that this was never really a story about a billionaire and a nurse. It was a story about 2 broken families finding their way back to whole, about a boy who got his father back, about another boy who finally got the father he never had, about a mother who spent years being strong for everyone else and finally got to be held for once instead of always being the one doing the holding. Grace kept working as a nurse, part-time, because she said saving lives was never about the paycheck. It was about who she was, and Nathaniel used a portion of his fortune to fund an entire wing at St. Andrew's Hospital dedicated to emergency cardiac care, a wing that today has a small plaque near the entrance, easy to miss unless you're looking for it, that simply reads, "In memory of every family who ever waited in a parking lot praying for someone to come home." Named in honor of Grace Miller Cole, the nurse who never stopped believing $9 and an act of kindness could change absolutely everything. And somewhere in that hospital, on quiet overnight shifts, new nurses just starting out, exhausted and worried about their own bills, their own rent, their own impossible months, sometimes passed that plaque on their way to the break room. And if they stopped to read it, they learned the story of a woman who had absolutely nothing except $9 and a willingness to kneel down on cold pavement for a complete stranger, and who ended up, in return, getting back an entire family, an entire life, and a love that started with a single act of courage on the very worst night of 2 people's lives.